Balake. Where is Balake at?
My name's Blake.
Do you want to go to war, Balake? I'm for real. Ron.
Ron is present. Welcome back, everybody, for more SPTV, where every day's a great day not to be in a cult. Speaking of which, Scientology. There are currently 5 outstanding legal actions against Scientology and its leader, David Miscavige. Quick recap. The first lawsuit is that Leah Remini is suing Scientology for essentially business interference, harassment, what they would call Scientology's fair game tactics. That lawsuit is currently on appeal by both sides because Leah Remini's complaint was struck by Scientology with an anti-SLAPP motion. The judge ruled partially in favor of Scientology's anti-SLAPP motion. Leah Remini is appealing, saying we don't like the fact that the judge threw out these portions of the lawsuit. Scientology is appealing, saying we don't like the fact that the judge only threw out these portions of the lawsuit. So that's lawsuit number 1. The second lawsuit currently pending against Scientology and its leader, David Miscavige, is the lawsuit brought by a number of Danny Masterson's victims, some of their family members, and some additional individuals, suing Scientology for stalking, harassment, intimidation, again, what you would call Scientology's fair game tactics. The third lawsuit is a child essay and trafficking lawsuit brought by Jane Doe 1 of the Danny Masterson criminal trial. That lawsuit is against a number of Scientology entities. It's against David Miscavige, Scientology's leader, as an individual, and another relatively well-known Scientology Sea Org member named Gavin Potter. That lawsuit is right on track and moving full speed ahead. The fourth lawsuit against David Miscavige and Scientology is by a woman named Valerie Haney, who used to work directly for Scientology's leader, David Miscavige, and his wife, Shelley Miscavige. Valerie had to escape from Scientology's international base by hiding in the trunk of a car of a non-Scientologist who happened to be on the base shooting a Scientology film. I would characterize that lawsuit as a trafficking lawsuit. That lawsuit has been diverted out of the courts and into internal Scientology arbitration, where it is presently hopelessly bogged down, while Scientology does pretty much whatever it wants to Valerie Haney because the courts have ruled that they can and that the court has no jurisdiction to intervene in any way, shape, or form. That brings us to the bad news of today. I don't like breaking bad news on Scientology lawsuits, but the bad news is the news. This is the lawsuit brought by Laura Baxter, her husband Gawain Baxter, and Valeska Paris, 3 former Sea Org members. They all live in Australia. They are suing David Miscavige and Scientology in a Tampa federal court for, again, what I'm going to call it a trafficking and child trafficking lawsuit. The judge in the Baxter Paris case said that U.S. Supreme Court precedent dictated that if there was a question about whether an arbitration agreement was signed under duress, it is actually the arbitration panel itself that has to take up that argument, and that the courts cannot. And it was on that basis that the case was ordered into internal arbitration. When the judge made that ruling, he acknowledged that it seemed unconscionable, but based on Supreme Court precedent, he felt he had no choice but to issue that ruling. That was about a year ago that ruling was made. That arbitration process is completely bogged down. In fact, it hasn't even started to the best of my knowledge. That was a year ago. We don't know why that's not going anywhere. The recent development in that case is that there was a Supreme Court decision from a few months back that revisited this whole area of law surrounding the enforceability of arbitration agreements, and that if there was any question about the validity of an arbitration agreement, is that a subject matter that would be heard by a court of law, or is that a subject matter that actually itself had to be determined by the internal arbitration panel? The attorneys for Baxter and Paris argued that the recent Supreme Court decision in Coinbase versus Susky clarified this matter and put the power back into the hands of the courts to hear an argument about whether an arbitration agreement was signed under duress. And on that basis, they asked the judge to reconsider his ruling, ordering the case into internal arbitration. Scientology's attorneys took great issue with this, and they said the plaintiffs are grossly mischaracterizing the nature of the recent ruling by the Supreme Court in Coinbase versus Susky. And the ruling had nothing to do with whether an arbitration agreement was signed under duress. The ruling had to do with whether there was 2 conflicting agreements signed by the same parties. One contract making an agreement to take matters to internal arbitration, and a separate contract signed by the same parties not agreeing to take things to arbitration. Based on that, Scientology asked the judge to reject the appeal, that he reconsider his own ruling throwing the entire matter into religious arbitration. Unfortunately, within the last few days, the judge has issued his ruling and he has sided with Scientology on this matter. The judge rules as follows. Upon careful consideration, the court concludes that, contrary to plaintiff's position, Coinbase does not constitute an intervening change in the law that would warrant reconsideration. In Coinbase, the Supreme Court considered who should decide the issue of arbitratability in the event of two conflicting contracts, one with an arbitration provision and one without an arbitration provision. The Supreme Court specifically noted that if the agreement with a delegation provision sending the case to arbitration were the only contract at issue, we would not be deciding this case, since the arbitration agreement quite clearly sends to arbitration disputes between Coinbase and its users. And the Supreme Court reiterated that in cases where parties have agreed to only one contract and that contract contains an arbitration clause with a delegation provision, then, absent a successful challenge to the delegation provision, courts must send all arbitratability disputes to arbitration. In the instant case, although there are multiple arbitration agreements, none conflict on the issue. Each agreement quite clearly sends disputes, including fraud and duress challenges, to the arbitrator. To be clear, Coinbase's holding does not constitute an intervening change in the law because its holding corresponds to a unique factual scenario that is not presented here, and Coinbase otherwise agrees with the well-established holdings of Buckeye and Prima Paint. Plaintiff's motion for reconsideration is therefore denied. This is unfortunately very bad news for Laura Baxter, Gawain Baxter, and Valeska Paris. They are about to suffer the same fate as Valerie Haney. Scientology is currently absolutely having its way with Valerie. Valerie's attorneys have asked the courts to give Scientology a date that they have to finish arbitration by. The court has absolutely refused to do or say anything further on the matter and have said Scientology has complete control, complete domain to do whatever the hell they want. Very bad news. Very bad news for this particular lawsuit. At this point, the only option it seems that Valerie Haney and the Baxters and Valeska Paris have is to complete the arbitration process at the full discretion of Scientology. And then after that is done, go back to the courts to file some sort of an appeal on the condition that the arbitration process is completely one-sided, completely unfair. The bad news there, at least for the Baxter-Paris case, is that appeal would be heard by the 11th Circuit, which has already in the past, in the Luis Garcia lawsuit, ruled in favor of Scientology, and they're just ridiculously unfair and one-sided arbitration process. So that is not looking good. At this point, the three lawsuits that are still moving forward is Leah Remini's lawsuit against Scientology, Jane Doe 1's lawsuit against David Miscavige and Gavin Potter, and the civil action brought by a number of Danny Masterson's victims and some additional individuals. As any updates come in on those cases, I'll be telling you all about it. Thank you for tuning in, everyone, and I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, if you want to see my rock and roll songs, click right on this guitar. And if you want to see a different one of my videos, then you could click right inside here. If you have subscribed or not, subscribe right here. Bye!